I'm Ian Kavat. Hello and welcome to Taiwan Talks at National Chengchi University. Beyond Taiwan, tensions have been escalating in the South China Sea. Repeated clashes between Chinese and Philippine vessels has led to increased cooperation between the United States and the Philippines. We asked today, has the South China Sea replaced the Taiwan Strait as the biggest flashpoint between the US and China? Let me introduce the four professors from NCCU today. We have Charles Wu, who is the Department of Diplomacy Professor and Chair, Huang Kwei-bo, Director of the Center for Global and Regional Risk Assessment, Chen Ping-kuei, Department of Diplomacy Professor, and Chia-yi, the Director of the International Masters Program in International Studies. A very warm welcome to the show today. So let's go to our first question from the audience.
So my name is Tina Yuan. My question will be, if the situation in South China Sea escalates into a regional conflict, would that imply that Taiwan becomes safer? Conversely, would Taiwan then become a valuable strategic partner for either the US or mainland China? So this is my question. Thank you.
So presumably you're talking about China essentially being distracted and that this perhaps might make Taiwan safer.
Yes.
Okay. Professor Huang.
First, if there's any conflict in the South China Sea, then I do not think Taiwan will be safer, because any conflict in that area, I mean the South China Sea, could be developed to the area of the Taiwan Strait easily. Not to mention, when there is a turmoil, then you don't know what the other parties, especially the party from Beijing, is going to do. So, of course, we'd like to try our best to maintain peace and stability, not only in the Taiwan Strait, but also in the South China Sea. And second, whether or not Taiwan will be a valuable partner for either US or mainland China, I actually do not know the current policy of the DPP government towards the South China Sea, because it has been so vague that I do not know whether or not the current government will have the strong will to defend those islands or islets owned by the Republic of China.
Professor Wu, how about Taiwan Strait itself? I think the question is, would it spread? Would it come over to Taiwan properly?
Yeah, this is another question I also want to jump up. What I say right now in the South China Sea, we can see the Sandy Cay issues, the Second Thomas shoal issues, they're getting more and more intense, which means there will probably be a potential conflicts coming in the near future.
Okay. Professor Chen, we've all seen Beijing's increasing use of water cannon in the South China Sea against the Philippines. Now, apparently Chinese researchers have developed the first AI-controlled water cannon. It will, reduce error down to just 2 meters in rough conditions. So what's behind Beijing's particular investment in this?
We know the weakness of the water gun is that it cannot target it cannot target very well. You will miss the target. So the impact it can cause is minimum. But this technology will make the weapon more lethal. Well,
how significant do you think Beijing considers, the water cannon itself, and
I think it's
means?
just one of the tools. So water cannon is considered a non-lethal weapon, right? So it's often used by the Coast Guard, and I think we will see that being deployed in South China Sea very soon.
Professor Lee, it's interesting, isn't it? Because it is classed as non-lethal, but when you see the sort of damage that it's done so far in recent weeks to Philippine Coast Guard, not just the civilian vessels. It's damaged, apparently, according to the Filipinos, $35,000 worth of damage to a Coast Guard vessel just recently. It's damaged the navigation and communications. And also, that is to a boat. So if this was actually directed at a person on the boat, one would imagine that would be quite lethal. I just want to quote to you that the force of that apparently is equivalent of nearly 9 tons if the water cannon is directed at a person. to a male, 9 tons, which is equivalent to being stepped on by an African elephant. So would that not seem to be lethal to you?
I would say, I think Beijing is quite smart in terms of using this kind of the so-called non-lethal weapon, because what is behind this is that Beijing is engaged in the so-called gray zone strategy in South China Sea. Because Beijing, obviously we can see that in recent years, China under Xi Jinping leadership has become more aggressive and assertive, and they want to increase the dominance and the control over the South China Sea.
So do you think you see the water cannon as being central to holding on to their claims?
It's very important for them to achieve their goal. That is to put more pressure over the Philippines or other Southeast Asian countries. But at the same time, they don't want to trigger any military response from the United States, obviously, because although China is still catching up, we know the US Navy still has the dominance in the maritime sphere. So China uses this gray zone strategy to increase its dominance and influence in the China Sea, but China doesn't want to
overstep that.
Escalate the conflict.
Invoke the Mutual Defense Treaty
Exactly.
between the US and the Philippines. Professor Huang, so it's interesting that Jay Tariella, the Philippine Coast Guard spokesperson, has been in the media recently. He's been addressing the calls for retaliation, by the Philippine Coast Guard. The Philippine Coast Guard also has water cannon, but a directive from Ferdinand Marcos Jr. Is to tell them not to use it. What do you think of that position?
I think amid the competition or conflict between Manila and Beijing over the South China Sea, I still sense some degree of self-restraint from the Manila side, while the mainland Chinese side actually is not adopting some full-scale measures on the South China Sea defense. So, on the one hand, both Manila and Beijing are competing for some part of the South China Sea on the sovereign issues. But on the other hand, I think they are still trying to, have some self-restraint in order to leave some space for the possibility of negotiation in the future.
Okay. Professor Wu, we've talked about how both sides are holding back. Again, I want to return to whether water cannon is really lethal or non-lethal. Do you think it would get to the point where it becomes a very fine line, the use of the water cannon, which we can expect that they will, the frequency and the intensity of this so-called non-lethal weapon will increase over time? This seems to be what Beijing wants to do. How do you think the Americans are viewing this and the recent incidents?
I don't see any chance right now in the United States want to step into this kind of chaos.
Do you think China is playing on that? Do you think that?
Let's see if the new president of the United States coming. We don't know who will win. So if the Trump wins, there will be totally different stories for the South China Sea. However, if Biden still maintains the position in the government, we call the Democratic alliances, the U.S. Philippines allies, probably they will maintain this kind of we call more intense situation in South China Sea.
Okay, Professor Chen, I want to quote to you something that Wu Shizun, who is the founding president of China's National Institute on the South China Sea, told a Chinese panel discussion recently. He said, I quote, "The 2016 arbitration ruling has already had a negative impact that can hardly be fully erased. But it's very important for China to stop the Philippines from going to a second arbitration." So Wu wants China to step up pressure on the Philippines to stop it from going to court again and setting a precedent for other countries, other claimants in the sea. What are your thoughts about this? Is this the first admission by China that they actually cared about this tribunal?
Well, China cares. China always cares about it. But China has a position it will have to secure, right? So it would try to deny the rulings of the arbitration. It is true that maybe the recent clashes along the Second Taiwan Shoal might be the concern of this. If the Philippine government has the chance to consider another arbitration supported by the United States, it will be harmful for China not to present on that arbitration because the first arbitration court already rules that the arbitration is effective. It has jurisdiction over the features in South China Sea. So it means that they don't have to go through this process again in a second arbitration, and the ruling will be the same disadvantages to China as well. So China would have to participate in that arbitration if there is another arbitration. So I agree with the two professors. I think China is trying to push but leave rooms for negotiation so they can at least talk about it and maybe de-escalate somehow.
Although increasing use of water cannon.
It is not likely a very peaceful means, right? Yeah, I can imagine. So I think that's the evidence of Beijing trying to put pressure on the Philippine government, and I don't think Philippines will yield, and Beijing will quickly learn that this is not working.
Professor Lee, do you agree with that? The Philippines won't yield. In fact, perhaps the more pressure put on it, the more it will go to court. But what's your view about this admission that China does not want more court arbitrations from, say, Vietnam? Obviously, would be the obvious claimant that Beijing is worried about. Do you think this gives these claimants leverage?
I think one thing we can consider is its own view about its international status in the international society. Because in the past 2 decades, actually China has been quite successfully using the multilateral system to enhance its own global influence, not just economic benefits, but also political influence at all, etc. So I think for China, it doesn't want the Philippines to file the case again, because the chance will be that the ruling will be again unfavorable to China. And we all know that China was not happy about the 2016 ruling, right? It doesn't like the results, and China even rejected the results. So if the result is not favorable to China, of course China will again deny this result. But this will not be a good thing to China's international reputation and image, because I think so far China has been trying to play a role as a responsible big power in the international society in many issues, not just like free trade, but also climate change and so on. So I think that's why one of the reasons why China doesn't want to see the case being filed again.
It would seem to give these countries more leverage. I mean, even just the threat of going to Court of Arbitration might shape Beijing's behavior.
Right. So I agree with Professor Ping-kuei that I don't see a strong reason for the Philippines to file the case again. But maybe discussing this can be a threat against China.
Okay, let's go for our next question to the audience again.
Good afternoon, host and our distinguished guests. I'm Teresa Ko. I'm currently in my second year of the master program of NCCU diplomacy. So I have the questions regarding the role of ASEAN in South China Sea. Specifically, unlike Philippines, Vietnam prefers to manage and isolate maritime issues from wider bilateral relations with China. So in face of this situation, what implications do the recent discourse have for the future of ASEAN's role in regional security architecture, especially in countering Chinese maritime assertiveness? So this is my question. Thank you.
So Professor Huang, if I can direct this question to you, what's the impact of what we're seeing at the moment in the South China Sea? What impact is that having on perhaps a future role for ASEAN in terms of security architecture? Is there any appetite for that, do you think?
The South China Sea issue has been a big quote-unquote problem for ASEAN for decades. And apparently, ASEAN member states have had different opinions about the resolution of the South China Sea issue. For example, the Philippines, Vietnam, they have common but differentiated stance on the South China Sea. Not to mention countries like Cambodia, Laos, and probably Myanmar in recent years are in full support of Beijing's stance. Therefore, I think ASEAN is having some problem unifying their respective member states' position towards this issue. But I think ASEAN has had a few security arrangements in relation to the South China Sea. For example, the ASEAN +1 meeting, the foreign minister, including ASEAN's 10 and Beijing's minister, could join to discuss the South China Sea issue. And the ASEAN Regional Forum, ARF, another big forum, not very effective, but still able to talk about the South China Sea issue. And the ongoing Code of Conduct dialogue or conference between Beijing and ASEAN remains ongoing and probably
unresolvable.
Unresolvable, but almost every year, since like 2018, 19, people say, oh, there will be an end of it. But still, this year, till today, we haven't seen any major progress in it. So anyway, but my point is, I am not that optimistic. So long as these mechanisms remain effective and dialogues continues, and I think the dispute or the possibility of any major conflict in the South China Sea will be smaller.
Okay, so final question, which takes us back to the beginning of the show. Professor Chen, if I can ask you, so has the South China Sea become the greatest conflict between the US and China, and has it replaced the Taiwan Strait?
Well, I wouldn't say that. According to International Crisis Group, an NGO that tracks conflicts, in the past 6 months, we have at least 3 events of deterioration in Taiwan Strait, but only 2 in South China Sea between Philippines and China. So I would say in the near future, Taiwan is still the most important hotspot in East Asia. Of course, we cannot ignore that there are intense clashes in South China Sea right now, but so far it doesn't involve military actions, right? But the crisis in Taiwan Strait usually involves military actions, exercises, passing of aircraft carriers, or present of forces. So these tell us that Taiwan Strait is something that many people should focus on. Many people should pay attention.
There's increasing military activity, though, isn't there, in the South China Sea, with increasing number of navies?
Naval forces, but by civilian ship and police ships, the coast guards, right? The clashes are basically between coast guards, not navies.
Yeah, but there have been drills.
Yeah, there have been drills. That's true.
By the America and its allies.
Right, but there are joint military exercises apparently try to target China, but we do not see provocative actions conducted by the United States for many years in South China Sea. For example, the U.S. vessels have not approached the 12 nautical miles of the Chinese-controlled islands. So I would say, I'm not saying that SCS is not important. I would just say that Taiwan Strait is probably more dangerous, has more risk, and it warrants our attention. And I believe the audience would agree that we should pay attention to what happens between U.S., China, and Taiwan.
Okay. That brings us to the end of our final show at National Chengchi University. I want to end by thanking my guests, Charles Wu, Huang Kwei-bo, Chen Ping-kuei, and Chia-yi. Thank you so much. And also our audience for their participation today. If you liked our show, please search for us on YouTube, give us a thumbs up, and hit subscribe to our show. Thank you for watching Taiwan Talks. Now, for a different perspective, I'm joined by Gemant Lalari, who is a visiting researcher at the Institute for National Defense and Security Research here in Taiwan, and he's also a visiting scholar here at National Chengchi University as well. Gemant, so can I get your thoughts on a possible South China Sea conflict and Taiwan's security?
If there's a conflict in the so-called South China Sea, if something happens with the Philippines or not, I think that Taiwan will be less safe because any conflict in the South, the so-called South China Sea, means that the whole area is going to be involved. I mean, on a simple economic level, there will be economic disruption for both imports and exports from all countries in the region, especially China, South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, Philippines.
If I could just jump in there.
Sure.
So you're saying that there will be an economic impact on Taiwan. So as in it will be vulnerable, and perhaps this is a good environment for China to take advantage. Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying that yes, and also people seem to separate the conflict that China would invoke with the Philippines and not connect it to the conflict between the communist China and Taiwan. I believe they are one and the same because they cover the same territory. Remember, there's a 10-dash line, and the 10-dash line includes Taiwan. So these activities are all connected because from China's perspective, Taiwan, the so-called South China Sea is all part of the same region that they claim. And so it's all connected.
And how about the issue also that right now, Xi Jinping has to be very careful or has to be very sure he wants to start a war. So if there was conflict already in the neighborhood, one would think that obstacle is no longer there.
Right. So, I mean, if there's a conflict in the region, I mean, if between China and the Philippines, for example, the U.S. is going to get involved based on the Mutual Defense Treaty. And then if the U.S. gets involved, it's going to need help with the Philippine neighbors. So the neighbors are Taiwan and Japan in the north, and then countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, Australia. These are all countries that are going to be needed to help the U.S. Papua New Guinea with the 6 new bases that they've opened up. So many countries in the region are going to get involved. And so if China sparks something, it's not going to be a simple little event unless the Philippines and the U.S. contain it. And don't forget, there are multiple treaties and security arrangements between all these countries in the region. We know about the U.S. to Asian countries, but there's also between Asian countries. For example, Japan and Australia have a security agreement. The Philippines is now discussing with Japan a security agreement, with Australia, with India. I mean, there are a lot of overlapping relationships that once something gets kicked off, it could start like a hornet's nest. It's gonna not be pleasant.
And is this the reason why we are seeing the Philippines stepping up in terms of, really coming to the fore to consider working with the US in terms of any Taiwan crisis because of the interconnectedness? We know for a long time that Japan knows that if there was a Taiwan crisis, its security would reduce. Yes,
and just like Japan understands that the U.S. will need to use the bases that U.S. military is stationed in Japan to help Taiwan. Taiwan needs to understand that they will need to help the U.S. and perhaps even get involved in some kind of a crisis with the Philippines. I mean, just recently, the Balikatan exercise was conducted. Although it was ostensibly a U.S.-Philippine exercise, it also included the Australians and the French. And guess what? 14 other countries were observers. And the list of countries is exactly the same list of countries we just talked about, who would probably be involved in a Taiwan crisis, which is code word for a war between China and Taiwan, such as Brunei, Canada, Germany, UK, India, Indonesia, Japan, Malaysia. These are all countries, New Zealand, South Korea, Singapore. These are all countries that are going to are watching the exercise and probably thinking about how they're going to deal with a problem in the Philippine and the West Philippine Sea. But it's the same countries that would be involved potentially in a Taiwan crisis.
So it's not just sort of their support for a rules-based order or democratic principles, these sort of things. It's actually self-interest.
Well, I hope it's self-interest, and I hope they see the greater picture. I mean, one of the problems of previous security arrangements like the CETO in the 1950s, it fell apart because a lot of these countries had different interests and there were different wars going on at the time. But I think a really good example of a treaty alignment that should be looked into is what was called NETO, Northeast Asian Treaty Organization, which included South Korea, Japan, US, and Taiwan. And last year, we saw the US, Japan, and South Korea agree on a trilateral security agreement. So that's the beginning, in my opinion, of a NETO without calling it that.
Can I get your thoughts on whether the South China Sea has replaced the Taiwan Strait as the greatest flashpoint between the US and China?
Actually, any border country around China is at risk for being a flashpoint. I mean, we saw it a couple of years ago with India, a few decades ago with Vietnam. I mean, with Japan in 2010. China is a bully, and they need to be stopped from being a bully. And the only way to do that is the countries that are in the area need to get together and just push back and say, stop bullying us, and show a united front against this kind of behavior.
We bring you stories from Taiwan.
Every day of the week.
Our reporters travel the nation.
Exploring the issues that matter to you.
News from here in Taiwan and around the world.
What's up, Taiwan? On Taiwan Plus.